Thanks so much for checking out our Bible school content. This is just a little technical note to say, unfortunately, we did have a problem with the video recording from the evening. Unfortunately, the file was damaged beyond repair. So in this video, you'll have PowerPoint slides and the audio from the evening, and it still works really great, and we hope it blesses you. And just to note that in the future, we do hope to have video recorded from these evenings. Thanks so much.
Okay, so, and there's reasons why we're doing this as well. It's not just as an icebreaker. Number 10, what do you reckon?
Is this backwards? 10?
We'll go from 10 to 1.
CEV.
No.
Good news.
The message. Now. It's going to be an order. I did say an order. I did. If it's not an order, it's just a list. It's got to be an order. 10 is the message, and almost certainly Clive's just sitting there now going, that's not a translation. Which, it's not my list, it's just the list. But, and, technically, we'll discuss whether that is a translation at some point. New American Standard Bible, number 9. Yeah. Number 8, New International Reader's Version. So the more child-friendly version of the NIV, basically. Number 7, not the Passion, not the ESV. The Reina Valera, Spanish. Worldwide, yeah. In the world. Worldwide.
Did you get it for me?
New King James. Number 6. Christian Standard Bible, the CSB. That's the one that Ollie preaches from all the time. Sorry? No, CSB, Christian Standard Bible. It was the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Now it's the Christian Standard Bible. 4, King James Version. Right, what do you reckon number 3 is in the world? New Living Translation, number 3. Okay, so 2 left. Which order are they going to be in? NIV what? Yes, it is. ESV number 2. New International Version number 1. Now, just for my own interests, hands up if you're NIV by choice. Lots of people. ESV? Less people. New Living? King James? King James. New King James? Okay. Christian Standard Bible? No one except Ollie and Terry. Okay. Just out of interest, hands up for the message is not a translation. And hands up for yes, it is. Half the people haven't voted. We'll get into that in the next few weeks. Okay, now, there are reasons why we're doing all this, which we will get into. Now, some of those translations we would technically call word for word. ESV, word for word. Technically, we call it word for word. NIV, not word for word, more thought for thought. Okay? None of them are word for word. Why is that? Steve? Wouldn't make any sense, which we'll do in a minute. Yeah, exactly. So generally, whether our Bibles are word for word like the ESV or thought for thought like the NIV and the NLT and so on, they all basically say the same thing, right? So if you're like Ruth that reads the NLT and you're like Clive that reads the NIV, and who was ESV? ESV like Bobby. It's the same gospel, it's the same truth, basically. Well, in fact, actually, not just basically, it's the same thing. You might hear them called formal equivalents or dynamic equivalents, depending on which one you read. And obviously one of them, or one camp, is much more meant to be literal, essentially literal, they call it, for translations like the ESV, and more dynamic equivalents for NIV and all those kind of, more getting the point across less literally, basically. But what we call word for word isn't accurate, and Steve was exactly right. So this coming Sunday, I'm preaching on Genesis chapter 12. If I were to start Genesis 12 word for word, so literally word for word, it would say this. And he is saying, Yahweh, to Abraham, go you, for you, from land of you, and from kindred of you, and from house of father of you, to the land which I shall show you. That's literally... Clive, can I drink of water? Is that all right? Oh, thank you. So, why do we not use literal translation? As Steve said, it wouldn't make any sense. And if you read through the whole Bible, word for word, from Hebrew or Greek, as close as possible, it would all look like that. And in fact, it would all look more like that. Because there's no spaces, there's no punctuation, it's all capital letters until the 10th century and so on. And even if we took, let's say, an English, as in one of our more obviously translated English. So Colossians chapter 1, verse 1, in English, thanks, Carrie. And you can make out that it says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. And then it goes a bit strange because actually the way it would have been literally written, if a word ends, or rather if a line ends in the middle of a word, you carry on in the next line. So actually, if we were to try and read the Bible literally, firstly it would look more like that, and he is saying Yahweh to Abraham, go you, for you, from land of you, and from kindred of you, and so on. And it would actually look like that, and it would be very difficult. Mainly so they can save space, basically. And then in the 10th century, someone said it would make more sense to have spaces. It would make more sense to break things up so they're easier to read. And as writing equipment was more readily available, you could write more easily, basically. It's mainly a space-saving thing. Partly because on the scrolls that the Old Testament was written on, they're massive, like huge scrolls. So, First and Second Chronicles is only First and Second Chronicles because it's so big on a scroll that you can't really get it on one scroll, and that's why it's book 1 and book 2 and so on. So, huge scrolls, save space, basically. And also, Christians were responsible for starting universities and hospitals and schools and so on and so forth. Apparently, also, Christians were responsible for inventing the printing press, and before that, the book. So it was actually New Testament manuscripts were the very first codexes. So where from massive scrolls, people started going, well, actually, if we write on both sides and then put it together, then we can have whole books of the New Testament and whole books of the Old Testament that we can carry around like this. So it was apparently Christians who were copying the New Testament that were responsible for inventing the book. And then, obviously, from there, you can get much more into spaces and, it's easier to write. Right. So, translation always involves interpretation. Clive. Ready?
Depends what you're about to say.
Can you get a King James version on your phone? Please. Can you read out nice and loud Numbers 23, verse 22?
Sorry, Numbers 20,
Numbers chapter 23, verse 22.
verse 22.
And Sally, you're next.
King James.
King James, it must be.
Verse 22.
Numbers 23, verse 22.
Okay. Good luck on this one, guys. Okay. God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of an unicorn.
Okay, good. There it is. Sally, can you read the same verse from the ESV? And this is one of the verses that skeptics throw out there as, the Bible talks about unicorns. Of course, it's not true, basically.
Okay. God brings them out of Egypt and gives to them like a horde of wild ox.
Okay. So, there you go and there you go. Which makes most sense? Unicorn? Okay. 1 vote for unicorn. 2. Good. Brilliant. Hands up, Numbers 23 in the King James. That makes more sense. An alarming number of people. And no, ESV. Less people. Which do you think, actually on this occasion, is the most accurately translated? It might depend whether you believe in unicorns. It might. One of those two is much more closely translated than the other. Yes. So the actual translation says the strength of a one-horned beast. And they didn't have rhinoceroses, in terms of didn't have the word rhinoceros, so it's a unicorn. It's got one horn. Which actually makes much more sense, particularly in 1611, than converting it into the ESV language of wild ox, which isn't actually what the text says. But Numbers 23 in the King James, if you're a skeptic, and maybe if you're not a skeptic, means you kind of have to believe in unicorns to accept that this is the word of God, when actually one-horned beast is a rhinoceros. It just didn't exist as a rhinoceros in terms of name, and that's why translation always involves interpretation and always throws problems out there, because you're always translating and translating and translating. Yeah. You know what I mean. Big horn. Giant horn. You know what I mean. One horn at the front, rather than 2 horns. Say again? Say again?
The NLT doesn't
No.
mention the horns. It says he is as strong as a wild ox.
Yeah. So that's taking the same idea as the ESV of wild ox. Yeah. So, the point being, does wild ox make sense? Yes, of course it does. Is it literally as well translated as unicorn? No, it's not. Does actually asking people to read and particularly non-Christians, the Bible talks about unicorns, it's quite a difficult thing to do. So actually just even a little bit of this kind of figuring out of what actually does that mean, unicorn, and how do we actually translate it and explain it to people when at work tomorrow someone says to Ray, Bible talks about unicorns, Ray. Explain.
They're reading Harry Potter.
And they're reading Harry Potter.
They're reading Harry Potter.
Exactly. Yeah. But translation is always going to involve interpretative issues, basically. It's a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, particularly. So, here's a question Michael Bowley asked me. He texted me at 11 o'clock at night about a month ago, and it said that, I'm possibly about to open up a can of worms, but why do modern translations leave out Matthew 17:21? Which again, good question. That's a really good question. You read the New King James, don't you? Which I found out yesterday. Which has the verse in it that you were talking about. And that's a really good question. Michael, could you read, actually Clive, can you read the King James again, please? And there's good reasons why, modern translations don't have that verse. And actually, there's a very good thing we can draw out from this in a minute. So, Clive, King James, Matthew 17:21.
Okay. Matthew 17:21. Howbeit, this kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting.
Good. So Jesus talking to the disciples about why they couldn't drive a demon out. Okay. Michael, New King James.
However, this kind does not go out except by praying and fasting.
Okay, there you go. Good and good. Sally, ESV.
But this kind never comes out except by prayer and fasting.
ESV?
Yeah, I'm an ESV.
ESV, there. But this kind never comes out except...
Oh, you're in the footnotes.
Oh, sorry.
And that's what happens
there.
when you read it on the
It's
phone.
not there.
And that's the main point I wanted to make tonight. For those of you not reading the footnotes on the phone, Sally? It's not there. No. NIV, Clive? Not there. So Michael's question, very good question. And you're reading the King James and the New King James. And then you're reading the ESV and the NIV. And there's a verse missing. And what do you do next? By going, but I believe the Bible. And the King James says this, and the ESV just doesn't even have it. Where do you think... I've just done it accidentally on the screen. So in my answer to Michael, I said, well, Michael, if you read what verse, what chapter, what verse, what book? Yep. Mark 9:29. So King James, so Gospel of Mark, same story. And he said unto them, this kind can come forth by nothing but prayer and fasting. New King James, so he said to them, this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. ESV, and he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. NIV, he replied, this kind can come out only by prayer. So I said to Michael, well, actually, yeah, it wasn't in the early manuscripts of Matthew. It wasn't there. That's why it's in Sally's footnote on her phone of, it probably says, early manuscripts didn't include this verse, or something like that. So it wasn't in Matthew, in the early manuscripts. But the same story, and we'll figure a pathway through as to why this doesn't actually cause us any problems at all. The same story does have, in all the manuscripts, in Mark, all the verses that you hope would be there. And Michael asked, he then texted me back at this point and he said, why did they take it out then? And Michael, what was my answer to that?
It's more that it was likely added rather than deleted.
There you go. Stop there. Stop there. So if it's not in the early manuscripts, it wasn't taken out. If it's not in the early manuscripts, it was added by someone later. And that actually is a good thing rather than a bad thing, which we'll figure out in a minute. So, and follow me through on this path, right? If, being honest, when you've come across verses like that, and it's just not there, and then you read the footnotes and they say, early manuscripts didn't include this, who has stumbled across those and gone, oh, that wasn't there? I wish actually it was all there. I wish all the texts were there. Yeah? Oh, yeah.
Well, it starts, you start wondering what other bits have been added,
Yeah.
all sorts of things.
Exactly.
You start questioning
Yeah,
the authority.
exactly.
Martin, if
Yeah.
you're saying that it was added, why is it then in the ESV goes from verse 20 to 22?
Because
Suggestions been taken out.
no, it hasn't been taken out. It hasn't been added. It hasn't been put in the ESV at all. When it's in manuscripts, like the King James, it's been added to the manuscripts when it shouldn't have been there.
I was going to say, but if you've got it as verse 20 and then it jumps to verse 22, that's suggesting it was in there, isn't it?
No, because chapters and verses weren't until the 16th century. So in the literal manuscripts, it just wasn't there. It just went straight through without being there. In Mark, it's there in all the manuscripts. And in the King James Version manuscripts, it's there, but it's been added. Sorry? Because some manuscripts have it. Because it was added later, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Don't worry about chapters and verses at all at this point, because they were a much later thing than any of this stuff. Yeah.
I don't know who says it, but don't they say also in the Bible, whoever adds or takes away? I can't remember how it will go, but
Yep.
they say about
Yep.
adding and taking away.
And that's a huge thing that lots of people with lots of energy to burn argue with each other about this kind of thing, basically.
Right, yeah.
Like huge amount. If you type in don't do this. But if you go home and you type in King James only controversy, you'll find thousands of people yelling at each other about verses that have been added and verses that have been taken away. And there's a book that someone wrote a few years ago, Gail Riplinger wrote, called New Age Bible Versions or New Age Bible Translations, where basically she says that any translation that isn't the King James is literally a New Age translation, and no one that reads it are Christians, and so on and so forth. That's a huge thing. No. And this, the strange thing is, this isn't arguing over doctrine, because it's in Mark's Gospel. It's not in Matthew's Gospel. That's fine, because it's just the Gospel according to Mark, and the Gospel according to Matthew, and the Gospel according to Luke, and the Gospel according to John, and they all harmonise with each other. And the fact that it isn't in, or wasn't in, the Gospel of Matthew in the first place doesn't matter at all. It just wasn't in the Gospel of Matthew in the first place until someone, and basically well-meaning, and what happened, generally, there's a lot of this, right? It's called harmonization, where copyists, and don't confuse the writers of the Gospel with people that copy the Gospel, basically. So the people that copied the manuscripts and copied and copied and copied. When the Gospel copyists, for better or worse, amend a manuscript, like in Matthew 17:21, what they're doing, so someone down the centuries was sitting there going, well, I know in the Gospel of Mark, this story happens, and these don't come out except by prayer and fasting. And I haven't got it in this manuscript in front of me that I'm copying in Matthew, but it's in Mark, so I'll add it to Matthew. So someone, somewhere, and more than one person, lots of people, would have sat with the Gospel of Matthew that didn't have that part of the story in it, that verse, known that it was in the Gospel of Mark, and gone, well, I'll add it here, because it makes sense. With no ill feeling, and actually no, I'm adding to the Word of God, because you're just kind of going, well, I know that this is in the Word of God. That verse is there.
In Mark?
Mark 9:29. So all they're trying to do is add harmony between the gospel writers, but then it does create a problem centuries later when people go, well, why is that verse not there? Why does my Bible go straight from 20 to 22 with nothing in between, and so on and so forth? But hopefully it doesn't actually pose anyone any problems, because was it Was it in the Gospel of Mark? Yes. Can we trust that it happened? Yes. And that Jesus said, this kind don't come out except by prayer and fasting. Can we trust it? Yes. Was it originally in the Gospel of Matthew? Well, all the early manuscripts say no, it wasn't. That line, that verse wasn't in the Gospel of Matthew. Does that matter? Not at all. Does that make sense?
Personally, because it's in Mark, it doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter at all.
Because the Gospels are very different,
Very.
differently anyway. So the same in essence, but obviously.
Yeah.
And actually it authenticates it even more so if they're not exactly 100%
Yeah.
copycat.
Yeah.
So,
And where we'll get to tonight, where we'll land tonight, is that actually, in a strange way, but in a truthful way, the more variations there are, actually, the more you can trust it. Actually, which we'll get to before 9:30. Don't worry, Terry. You okay? I thought you had your head in your hands. Yeah. Yeah. No, there's quite a few harmonizations, and that's why people argue about manuscripts of it's in this one, it's not in that one, it's been added, it's not been added, and so on. But actually none of it matters. And like Aggie just said, where we'll land tonight is that it actually makes it it does make it more easy to believe, because if every single bit of every single story was exactly the same, that wouldn't add up. And
The point is there's also no conspiracy, because
No.
do clearly say this verse is not here, this there's
Yep.
no like hidden agenda.
no, it's not a secret. It's not a secret. But Michael asked me at this point in our conversation, Michael asked me a very interesting question, which was, but the Mark verse is missing the part about fasting. It just says prayer, right? So when you go back to the ESV and NIV, this kind can only come out by prayer, this kind can only come out by prayer. Which is a really good question, because the King James says prayer and fasting. And Michael said to me, but surely prayer and fasting are really important, so why is that not there? And again, really good question, and I think something which is nice now that we can talk about. The Greek word used there, Aggie, how do I pronounce that word properly? Say again? Proseuchi. Okay. That's the Greek word used for prayer and fasting, right? So in the ESV and the NIV, for example, they call that word prayer and fasting. In the King James and the New King James, they call it prayer, and in the King James and New King James, they call it prayer and fasting. The thing is, the same word is used in Luke 6:12, right? So, Sally, can you get your ESV and read Luke 6:12 out, please?
In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God.
Okay, one more time.
In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God.
Good. And can you also read out the... Actually, no, don't worry, because I've got that one here. Sorry. So there's the same word in Mark 9:29. Anything but prayer, anything but prayer. Read yours one more time, Sally.
In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God.
Right, good. And this is our kind of first problem with English translation, right? That word prayer sounds pretty different to what Sally's just described from Luke 6. So one more time, Sally.
In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer.
Okay. If you're praying all night, that isn't just prayer meeting starts at 7:30 and we'll be done by 9. Prayer. If you're praying all night, and if Jesus is trying to get the point across to his disciples that actually, if you want to see this type of demon leave, you've really got to pray. Really got to pray. It's not just drive everything out immediately. You've really got to be praying. Problem is, for us, in our English translations, is we haven't got a word that means that kind of prayer, which is why some translations call it prayer and fasting, some translations call it prayer, we literally don't have the right word for that kind of intense, all night on the mountain praying. You've got to keep praying, keep praying, keep praying. Which actually is an interesting, I find an interesting thing that what we tend to call prayer and fasting, obviously, is much more, I won't eat lunch tomorrow, I'll pray for half an hour at 1 o'clock instead of eating, or I'll fast Instagram, or I'll fast from Netflix. And that's partly because we don't have the right English word for what Jesus is talking about and what the Gospels are talking about with, it's the kind of prayer where you go up a mountain and you pray all night and you fast because you're praying all night. You don't fast because it's 1 o'clock and I'm going to pray now. You fast because I didn't realise what the time was because I've been praying all night and I've been praying all day. So it's much more that kind of thing where you're praying so intensely that it starts in the morning and it ends in the afternoon or the evening and you haven't realised you haven't eaten. And that's entirely because we haven't got the right words in our language to actually translate what the Bible meant. And it's much more a reflection, that kind of thing's much more of a reflection of the limitations of our language from being able to understand the Bible. And being able to understand, actually, that word means you go up a mountain and you don't stop praying. And it isn't just pray and fast. Which, you know, it's quite a challenging thing. And I think, hopefully, interesting to kind of dive into specific words like this as well. And actually, let's really pull out the meaning of the word and the meaning of the passage and the meaning of the verse. And the nice thing is that when Michael texts me saying, I've got a bit of a problem because that verse is missing and that word's different, it's like, actually that gives us an opportunity to really drill into languages and translations and figure out, actually, Michael, the most important thing is probably you and I aren't praying as intensely as we should. And it's entirely began from, why is that verse missing? And it's quite nice the way that actually, I guess by his divine providence, God kind of teaches us stuff even through our own limitations and translational problems and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Are you kind of...
Thank you.
That's all right. Is everyone's currently fairly happy that there's some verses missing and it's all right? Good. Good. Clive said to me a couple of weeks ago, he said, you've got to make sure on that first week you don't really scare everybody. So, let me know if I am. Okay.
When it says kind, what is it referring to when it says?
Basically, stronger demon than it needs you to go up a mountain by yourself all night to prepare. That kind of thing. Much more. It needs much more intense faith on behalf of us. Okay. And the whole kind of harmonization thing in the Gospels, and one thing we will refer back to a lot over the next few weeks is that actually, and again, you know, you'll hear skeptical people kind of say, yeah, but if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're really different from each other, and John's totally different to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so on. And actually, they were always intended to be the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And right from really early in the New Testament church, you only ever were given, from really early, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in a book. And it was always the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John, and it's the Gospels. And you read them and you harmonize them yourself if you're in the first century church and so on. So it's only kind of now where people forensically find differences. Back then, in the early transmission of it, it was someone handed you a codex and it had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it might have had Acts in it as well. And you read them and went, great, it's the Word of God. And right from really early on.
But
All good?
Isn't it said, though, that some of the others, particularly Matthew and Luke, are based on Mark?
Yeah, so Mark is widely believed to be the first gospel written, and probably from Peter's teaching that Mark wrote down from the way Peter taught. And then Matthew based on Mark, and Luke, we'll get into Luke next week properly, but Luke kind of summarizing and putting in order the whole thing. So if you, Luke's gospel, we'll get into this next week, but Luke, I love the way Luke's gospel begins, because Luke basically begins by saying, you've heard this from the eyewitnesses, I'll put it in order for you and tell you what happened. And it's just a kind of chronological going through the other stories, Matthew and Mark. And then John's different. Right, next task. Stick those in date order, please. Of when they were published. Okay. What's the oldest one of those? A few of them were from Latin, 2 or 3 of them. Wycliffe was the oldest, based on Latin Vulgate. Latin Vulgate just means common Latin. So that's the oldest, and there's reasons we're doing this as well. Next one, second oldest. Yes, Tyndale. Based on Greek and Hebrew rather than based on the Latin Vulgate, though. Sophie, ready for the question that you know I'm going to ask you in a minute? When was Tyndale martyred? What year? When was Tyndale martyred? 1539. Actually, it was 1536. 1536. And what the reason I'm asking this is because Ben Virgo told you last week. What was his final sentence that he said as he was being tied to the stake? Tyndale's, Lindsay's? Oh, yeah. Oh, Lord, that you would open the eyes of the King of England was Tyndale's last sentence as he was being tied to the stake and burnt alive. And then 1539, the next translation, became the first authorised by the King version. So it was only 2 or 3 years after Tyndale was martyred that actually God answered his prayer and he opened the eyes of the King of England. And that became the first authorised version, which is amazing. Next one. Say again. Next one. Geneva, yes. And that one was the first Bible to use paragraphs, chapter and verse numbers. So that was the first time this verse is missing, it's verse 21, was mid-16th century. Also used by Shakespeare in his later plays. So next time you hear Clive preaching and reciting Shakespeare to us like he does. Gillian, tonight when he's reciting Shakespeare to you and it's from the Bible, it's the Geneva Bible that he's reciting from. And if that Bible was the basis for the Textus Receptus, the received text, the next one must be King James. Yeah. Yep. So the received text, and actually, just FYI, I've deliberately put a load of slides at the end of this as appendices that go into the Latin Vulgate and the Textus Receptus and stuff. We won't do now, but there's a load of stuff at the end of this if you want to delve into it at home. Next one. English Revised Version. which was a revision of the King James, basically. So that was a revision of the King James. I haven't put every single revision in here, just some of the main ones. Next, Revised Standard Version, which was the revision of the English Revised Version. Next, the New American Standard Version, which was basically a revision of the Revised Standard Version, which was the revision of the English Revised Version, which was a revision of the Authorized King James Version. Next, the NIV, 1978. Next, the New Living Translation, 1996. Why are those two in blue? Because they weren't revisions of the King James, the English Revised, the New American, etc. They weren't based on those versions. They used a lot of the same manuscripts and the same text, but they weren't revisions of the same thing. And ESV, 2001. And the ESV actually is a revision of the King James via the ERV, the RSV, the NASB, etc. It's a revision down the years.
Martin, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So the Wycliffe Bible says based on Latin, and the Tyndale based on Greek and Hebrew. What's the difference? How does it make a difference? I thought it was all based on Latin.
Okay. The short answer to that. The short answer is there's another huge fight amongst people as to whether the King James Version based on the Latin translations is the received text. That should be the one that we all read. Or whether it's the translations of the Hebrew Bible, not the Greek into Latin, into English, etc., etc. So it's basically, and actually there's half a dozen slides at the end of this as the appendix, which goes into Latin Vulgate and so on, which just kind of walks through 4th century. 4th century is where Jerome translated it into Latin, and then that became the basis for the King James. And then there's a whole load of people going, no, it's not that, it should be this, basically. That's a very short version of a very long story. But it's kind of two sides of the coin where some people are going, it's the received text via Latin, and no, it's not actually, it's the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek and translated into English and so on. So.
Bible, which was in Latin,
Yep.
and was only being able to, so the priests were the only people that had access to it.
Yep.
So the Wycliffe Bible
Yep.
is based on that.
So the short answer to that is that's next week. Basically, that's the very short answer. Because that's where you get into the Apocrypha as part of the Catholic Bible and the apocryphal books and whether they should or shouldn't be part of the Bible and all that. That's all next week stuff. Is it all right if I leave it till next week? Is that okay? Thanks. That might be a rabbit hole I don't get back out of in time. Okay. So, if the ESV is derived from the KJV, which it is, revised and so on, and updated because it needed to be through different language changes and so on. If the ESV is derived from the KJV, but differs in a number of places, why would that be? If it's a revision of it, how can it be pretty different? Partly interpretation and language changes and, that word means something different 200 years later than it did then. So, yep.
I suppose it depends on how great the differences are.
Pretty different. Different enough for people to fight a lot over it. There's lots of fighting.
Finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1946.
Sure, it's 46.
Well, 10 years after.
Yes. So, and we'll get into the Dead Sea Scrolls in a minute. Lots and lots of manuscripts have been found much later than 1611, basically. Lots of them, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. Lots of manuscripts have been found, written a long time before 1611, obviously, but found a long time after 1611. And 1940s, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And they're still finding stuff in the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. I saw a fortnight ago. Did anyone see on the BBC News app about 2 weeks ago that they discovered 3 swords? Yeah? 3 swords near the Dead Sea. There's a little news thing that said they discovered 3 swords in caves near the Dead Sea. A whole news article about these 3 swords they'd found in caves near the Dead Sea. And there's a little one-liner in that news article that said, 5 decades ago, they found some Hebrew manuscripts there. And that was it. And those Hebrew manuscripts they found there was most of the Hebrew Bible, kind of word for word as we have it now. So lots of those manuscripts were found post-1611, which is why the ESV has them, and the NASB and the NIV and so on and so forth, because they hadn't been found when the King James was written. We don't have any original manuscripts. Don't have them. And again, people, some people, skeptics would say, that's a problem. But it's not, which we'll see in a minute. What's one of the main reasons we haven't got any of the originals, the autographs? In fact, probably what's the main reason? Say again? Well, actually, yeah, a lot of them would have been destroyed. Yep, that's true. And then destroyed in the early 4th century when the church was decimated before 313. Yep. And they were basically written on paper. So when codices were invented and you could write much more on double-sided leaves, the New Testament was written to be copied and copied and copied and dispersed and, sent out into the world. One of the reasons there's no autographs, originals, is it was written on basically paper, leaves, dried leaves, and couldn't still exist. And by the time you've written it and then pass it to someone to copy and pass it to someone else and pass it to someone else and pass it to someone else, it's not going to last more than a few years anyway. So you couldn't keep the autographs. So we have copies of copies of copies, but, and the good news, I think this is very good news, this next bit, it's by a long way, the New Testament is the most well-documented piece of work by miles. Have a look at these stats. So between the oldest New Testament manuscripts being written and our first surviving copies, 25 years, the Gospel of John, which I'll show you in a minute, and then all those other figures from, down the ages of, most people would say, well, yes, of course, you read Plato and you believe Plato and so on and so forth. There's 1,200 years between when Plato wrote and the first surviving copy, which is a long time, and 1,000 years for Tacitus and 500 years for Homer, and people study their degrees in those kinds of texts and Homer and so on, and actually believe it without question of, yep, this is what it says and this is what it is. And there's 500 years between when Homer wrote and the first surviving copy, only 25 years, and probably less, possibly even less, between the first fragment of John's Gospel that we've got and when it was actually written, basically, which is amazing. And if you count on how many manuscripts we've got, nearly 5,700 surviving New Testament manuscripts. When you get to Plato, 7. So 1,200 years between Plato writing and the first manuscript that exists, and there's only 7 of those. And 25 years between the New Testament being written and the first surviving manuscripts, and 5,700 of them. which again, you begin to then go, well, probably there's going to be differences between this manuscript of Matthew's Gospel and this one. Probably thousands of them, which is good news, I think. As I mentioned earlier, up until the 10th century, everything capital letters, no punctuation, no smaller letters, no spacing, nothing like that. Codex SIUS is the most well-known 4th century text that we have. And this is the one that a massive part of our New Testament, there it is, massive part of our New Testament is directly from that, basically. So whether it's NIV or ESV or NASB and so on, massive part of your New Testament is copied directly from that, Codex SIUS, which wasn't discovered until the 19th century, but was written in the 4th century. And actually that picture, I took that picture on my phone last week at the British Library, 4th century, 325, I think they've dated it at. I'll show you that in a minute. So that's in London in the British Library. I took that photo on my iPhone last week when I went to the British Library. And Codex SIUS is sitting right next to Codex Alexandrinus in the British Library. And no one looks at it, they're just sitting there. And then about 15 feet away, they've got a load of John Lennon's lyrics and Beatles stuff, and people flock to that. And basically, the whole New Testament is in that book, and most of the Old Testament, and it is basically what our Bibles in this room are copied from. It's amazing. So, and look how neat that is. And all handwritten, like written by hand. And they reckon 3 people, they sort of looked at it and figured out that 3 different people wrote that manuscript. It's amazing. Right. Now we're into the older stuff. So, over this next few weeks, whenever we talk about P46, P52, P75, etc., etc., that's papyrus number, whatever, right? So there's a manuscript. P46, papyrus number 46, and question, who wrote Hebrews? Discuss. You've got 30 seconds. That was a nice short answer. Boom. But we're not absolutely sure. Okay. Right, you probably don't need longer than that. Probably the most amount of syllables you've just said to each other is 3. Or maybe 1. Right. After 3, shout your answers out. All together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Paul, Apollos, Luke, Barnabas, don't know. Okay. Right, does anybody know? Steve, do you know?
Absolutely, 100%.
Okay, fine. So, now, reason for asking that question is this. So, as part of that manuscript, you know, when you look at all the pages of it, P46, New Testament manuscript, as part of that, we have Romans. I put a little asterisk there because it's not the whole of Romans, but most of Romans. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, so Romans, written by Paul, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, written by Paul, Ephesians, written by Paul. Figured out where we're going. Galatians, written by Paul. Philippians, written by Paul. Colossians, written by Paul. And Hebrews. Thus proving Paul wrote Hebrews. Right. Sorry? No, there's more of it. That's just part of it. That's, yeah. 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 Yeah, they use far fewer words than we use. No, that's just part of it. So I've always been of the opinion, I have no idea at all whether I'm right, I'm far less certain than Steve is. I've always been of the opinion that Paul wrote Hebrews and that it was written down, transcribed by Luke. That's always been my opinion. Because it's kind of Hebrew type teaching, but it's not Paul language, it's much more Luke language. So my own opinion has been that I think Paul wrote it, but it was Luke writing down. And I read... Sorry?
You don't agree with that?
What?
Well, there's a lot of debates about it.
Hang on, I'm not finished. Clearly the inflection in my voice is continuing. Recently, I read something fascinating, that Clement of Alexandria apparently said that his opinion was that Paul wrote it and Luke wrote it down. So it was Paul teaching and Luke writing. And because Paul considered himself as being sent by God to the Gentiles, but not sent by God to the Hebrews, he wouldn't have written his own name on a letter to the Hebrews, because out of respect to God, he would have said, God, you're the apostle to the Hebrews. I'm not putting my name on this letter, but I will put my name on the other letters, which I just found quite interesting. So, I may be wrong, Clive, but I found it quite interesting. Steve thinks I'm right. Yeah.
It's directed to the Jews.
Yeah, so Paul would, he wouldn't have, the assumption is that because he's not writing to Gentile churches, he wouldn't have been comfortable by saying, I am sent by God to you. Which is quite interesting. And?
One of them written to Jewish churches. Is it Revelations, is it? Or is each one of them? Like, is there not like, because it's all about circumcision?
Yeah. It's F.F. Bruce that said that. I'm just saying. But it is interesting that Hebrews is part of that, with a whole bunch of Paul's letters. And the entire point isn't who wrote Hebrews. The entire point is that from very early on, Paul's letters were bound, distributed, and read as authority amongst the churches. That's the point. So just as much as it doesn't really matter whether Matthew left a verse out that Mark put in there and so on, it was taken as this is the voice of God being written down. Yeah.
These days, if I'm writing a message to someone like a letter, you always put who is to and who is from.
Yeah.
So like any letters in the Bible that there's no kind of author in there, like that's odd, at least to us. Like what's the reason? Is there any reason? Like if you get a letter and there's no one who doesn't say it's from, that would just creep me out.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we'll get into that next week, because next week we'll start to get into, did Paul write 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, or was it someone else writing on his behalf, and the pseudepigraphical, some people call them, so basically some people think that Paul didn't write all the letters attributed to him, but that wouldn't necessarily have been a problem, because actually in those days, whoever it was being addressed to and from, the authority came from the name, like you're saying, so it kind of doesn't matter whether it was Paul that wrote 1 Timothy, to a certain extent, because if it's got Paul's name, it comes with Paul's authority. We'll get into that next week as well. There's lots of stuff we'll get into next week. Yes?
What was the date of
P46 is one of the very early ones. P52 is the earliest that we're about to look at. P46 is it's either 2nd or 3rd century. It's earlier than the Codex SIUS. I think it's 2nd century, I think. Next one P52, 2nd century, and latest 2nd century. So they reckon this one might be as early as, you know, right at the turn of the 1st century, like 90, 95, maybe, you know, 1st century.
Is that still papyrus?
Yes.
And that
Yeah.
lasted?
That little tiny, tiny fragment of John 18. But the important thing there is, even though it's a tiny fragment of John, two things important actually. It was found in Egypt, so even by very early in the 2nd century or late 1st century, so not many years after John wrote it, it was already being copied and had transmitted as far as Egypt, even just a few years after it was written. And very importantly, when that's compared to our modern translations, there's only two words that are different. So right at the beginning, John's Gospel basically was John's Gospel that we read 2,000 years later, which is pretty good news.
How do these things survive?
Lots of them have been found in Egypt. So they've been found in caves, and you know, we'll get into the Dead Sea Scrolls in a minute. They're stuck inside pottery and that kind of thing, and someone digs them up searching for precious metals and stones, and it turns out to be a little fragment of text and that kind of thing. A lot of, I think I'm right in saying that the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think, were found by a 13-year-old, I think. Just like digging in a cave and went, oh, what's that? It's a load of pottery with the Old Testament in it, basically, which is amazing. Sorry? That would have been written in Hebrew. Greek. Greek, not Hebrew. But, you know, when you hear people say, nobody even wrote the New Testament down until the 4th century, this is not true. Because we've got archaeological proof that it was written in the 1st or 2nd century, and there it is. So, generally when people do say to you, it wasn't even written down till the 4th century, generally what they mean is until it was kind of officially canonized by Constantine in the 4th century. That's sort of what they mean, but it's not true, basically. You might hear people say they couldn't agree on how many Old Testament books. Not true again. Originally, some of them were combined, for example, 1 and 2 Kings, Ezra and Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations. So our 39 books often were called 22. So when you read historians say there are but 22 books in the Old Testament, that's what I mean. You're doubling up some of the ones that obviously double up. And sometimes you hear people say 24, and they mean Judges and Ruth, Jeremiah, Lamentations. Doubled up there as well. Right. How are we doing? Everyone doing all right? When there's more than 39, that's when you are adding to the Bible, and you shouldn't do that. They're all the same books. We'll get into the Apocrypha next week. Yeah. Yeah. The Gnostic Gospels and Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, and the Old Testament Apocrypha, Tobit and Judith and Enoch, yeah. And the books that weren't easily agreed as part of the New Testament, like James and Jude and all that stuff as well. We'll do that next week. Just FYI, Hebrew and Aramaic, almost all Hebrew, couple of books, some Aramaic for the Old Testament, some of the chapters of Daniel, some of the chapters of Ezra, and a couple of verses here and there, but basically 95% Hebrew, New Testament Greek. And basically, and one of the reasons why we do end up with translational conundrums to solve, it's been translated from one language to another all the way through. You know, Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English, or Hebrew to Latin to English, Greek to English. Is, you know, lots of problems with language, basically, lots of challenges with language. But like I saw earlier, you know, if you actually drill down into actually what did this word mean in Greek or in Aramaic, it's, you know, there's some pretty interesting stuff to be found. Right, the Masoretic text. Most of our Old Testament is from there, from the Masoretic texts. Basis of ESV, NIV, etc., etc. Written between the 6th and the 10th century by Jewish rabbis, the Masoretes. They added vowels to the Hebrew manuscript, so there weren't vowels in the Hebrew language. Right? So actually the thing we started with, where I put all of the text together as one column, that also wouldn't have even had any vowels in it, as well as being just a whole line of text and so on. So, pretty complex. This is amazing. I find this really amazing, this next series of facts. So the Masoretes, who copied the Old Testament and just had such a reverence for copying the Word of God precisely, this is how they did it. So they'd count the verses and the words and the letters of every book they were writing. They count the number of times each letter was used in each book, and noted the verses that contained all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, 22 letters, or specific numbers of letters. They calculated the middle letter, the middle word, and the middle verse of the Pentateuch, first 5 books. They calculated the middle verse of the Psalms, the middle verse of the entire Bible, so that when each scribe had finished writing the Bible, it could be checked for its accuracy, and if any of that stuff was wrong, they buried it in the ground, which is amazing. Which is, that's just mind-blowing in terms of dedication. And there's a couple of amazing things I think about to happen. And one of the reasons we don't have many early manuscripts is because a lot of the ones that had mistakes were destroyed, which, a shame they were destroyed, but good at the same time in terms of accuracy. Which might mean you ask yourself that question, isn't 10th century a little late to be trusting the accuracy of the Old Manuscripts, Old Testament? And the answer we've already heard is Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah. So discovered in northwest side of the Dead Sea in 1948, dated as far back as 250 BC, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Which is amazing if you think only discovered 70 odd years ago and had been sitting there since 250 years BC, and then a 13-year-old lad was playing in the sand and dug up a load of pottery, and there's the Old Testament. Lots of the Old Testament, including almost, in fact, I think the whole of Isaiah, Psalms, Deuteronomy, Exodus, lots of it is there, and they're still finding bits of it now amongst the swords that they're finding. This is amazing. Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls is almost identical to the Masoretic text of Isaiah 1,000 years later. So for 1,000 years, there's a couple of words that are different in the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic text, and a couple of spellings, but basically for 1,000 years, Isaiah is exactly the same, word for word and spelling and everything, from the Dead Sea Scrolls through to the Masoretic text in the 10th century. Also, in the Masoretic text, Daniel 2 verse 4 changes language from Hebrew to Aramaic, and then back to Hebrew in chapter 7 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, exactly the same place and exactly the same verse and exactly the same word that it does in the Masoretic text 1,000 years later, and that's the same as what we have in our Bibles now. So Daniel chapter 2 verse 4 changes Hebrew to Aramaic 250 years BC in exactly the same place that Sally's Bible on her phone does today, which is good news. Very good news for the accuracy and authenticity of the Bible. And one more fact about how, again, they kept it so pure from 1,000 years. So this is from the Jewish Talmud, for when they were copying the Pentateuch. And this was written down for them to follow. Between every consonant, the space of a hair or thread must intervene. Between every word, the breadth of a narrow consonant. Between every new parasha or section, the breadth of 9 consonants. Between every book, 3 lines. The 5th book of Moses must terminate exactly with a line, but the rest not need do so. Besides this, the copyist must sit in full Jewish dress, wash his whole body, not begin to write the name of God with a pen newly dipped in ink, and should a king address him while writing that name, he must take no notice of him. The roles in which these regulations are not observed are condemned to be buried in the ground or burned. And again, it's like, how can we, what grounds have we got to trust the accuracy of the transmission of the Bible? Lots. Basically, loads of reason to trust it. But, okay. How many, so textual variation, anything that's different from one manuscript to another, basically. Anything. Any difference. How many in the New Testament do you think there are? How many textual variants? If we got every New Testament manuscript that is in existence, every single one of them, how many differences would we find? 10-second discussion. The Jewish scribes, basically. Not many of them. Like, not many of them were allowed to. Not many of them could. Not many of them could do it accurately enough, etc., etc. So, which is why, compared to the New Testament, kind of lots of mistakes because everybody that could write is copying it. I think it must be. Even though it's got lots of variations. Okay. So, Gail, what do you reckon?
Well, it's either loads or none.
It is either loads or none. I'd go for loads if I were you. How many do you reckon?
Are we going loads?
Loads. Loads of them. How many do you reckon? There's not that many. Possibly, and don't panic. In fact, the next slide is labelled "Don't Panic" at the top, right? Oh, possibly as many as 400,000. The end. Goodbye. See you next week. Happy reading. Right, now, and this is a good thing, right? This is going to be a good thing. Bart Ehrman, who was an evangelical Christian, who is now an aggressive agnostic, he's the professor, he's the New Testament professor in the University of North Carolina. And his entire life's work these days is trying to turn Christians away from being Christians. So if you get into his New Testament classes, he will spend the entire time trying to convince you that you're wrong and the Bible's wrong and you can't trust it. And he said that there are more variations than there are words in the New Testament, which is true. There's 140,000 words and 400,000 variations. So, okay, fair enough. But, don't panic. So, let's say I said that, which is true, right? So Bart Ehrman wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, which he did. So let's say I write that down and Clive writes that down. Okay, making notes. Only Clive doesn't write that down. Clive writes, Bart Ehrman wrote the book Misquoting Jesus, which is different. And it's not the exact same thing that I wrote, and in fact it's different in two places, because I wrote A and Clive's written the, so different, right? And then let's say Ray makes notes, and Ray goes, Bart Ehrman wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, which is different again, right? And then Ruth writes down as well, and she copies it. Bart Ehrman wrote Misquoting Jesus. Different again. Lots of textual variants there. None of those things add up at all. They don't agree at all. But what facts do we know? Bart Ehrman wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. That's not possible to dispute at all. And actually, when you look at those four statements, if someone that isn't here tonight read those four statements, if anything, they go, oh, there's no problem there at all. Those people have written it down a bit differently to each other. But then let's say Sally mishears completely and writes down, Mark Herman wrote the book Misquoting Jesus. And now we've got that added to it as well, right? Does that pose a problem? Does it? So if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Probably, where do you land? You probably land with, there's somebody called Bart Ehrman, and he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, and whoever wrote that down actually has got it wrong. Probably. I don't think you end up going, oh, I've got no idea whether it's Bart Ehrman or Mark Herman, because there's no reasonable, rational, logical reason to end up there. And what you definitely don't do, which is what Bart Ehrman does, what you definitely don't do is you don't go, well, I don't quite know what happened there, but now I don't believe that Bart Ehrman exists, and I know he didn't write any books. Like, you can't reasonably land there at all. You can't become a Bart Ehrman atheist by reading that slide and going, don't understand, don't believe in him. So all of his problems, 400,000 of them, they're all that, basically. So whenever anyone says to you, but it's got hundreds of thousands of changes, well, it has. And none of them mean a thing at all. And actually, where they do potentially mean anything, the only variants that actually mean a thing, other than, the misspelling of Bart Ehrman, for example, the only ones that mean a thing are where occasionally you've got some books will say the Lord Jesus and some books will say the Lord. There's that kind of variant, which actually still doesn't mean anything. And they can be a good thing.
You said he was an atheist, and then you also
He was an evangelical Christian, and now he's a...
Yeah, but you said he was an atheist, and then you said he was agnostic. Which is he now agnostic?
Oh, he's agnostic.
Agnostic. Yeah. So he's still room to develop.
He believes in the historical life of Jesus, doesn't believe the Bible's true, doesn't believe Jesus died and rose from the dead, doesn't believe the gospel, basically. He'll accept that historically Jesus lived and died, but the Bible's wrong.
He's a believer in God?
No, he doesn't believe in God at all, actually.
So he's an atheist?
He's not like a passionate atheist, as in, don't believe in God, and if he did exist, he's not that kind of person, but just doesn't believe. So, one more little thing. 7th century, the third Caliph Uthman, so big cheese, Islam, basically, 7th century. In the 7th century, and Clive will be doing a week or so on the Quran and the Bible in a few weeks' time. In the 7th century, the third Caliph Uthman heard that there were textual variants beginning to be in existence in the Quran in Iraq and being read in Iraq. So he ordered an official version to be copied of the Quran and every other version to be burnt, and all the other Islamic books to be burnt as well in the 7th century. At which point, obviously what he's doing is going, well, there's no textual variants now, because there's only one Quran, and there's only one copy of the Quran, and there's only one official copy of the Quran. Problem is, you can't trace back its accuracy at all, because you've destroyed every copy, every other version, and said, this is now the Quran, the end. So actually, all of the, in a way, problems of, but there's loads of different things in the Bible. Well, they're already good things. Because actually, if there's loads of differences, and you can still trace it all the way through and go, none of the differences mean a thing, and all it does mean is that when 50 scribes were sitting in a scriptorium, some of them heard some of the language a bit different to others, and that's why it's different. That, if anything, proves the accuracy of the Bible, whereas you can't prove the accuracy of the Quran, because if you've only got one version of it with no variants, well, who's to say what the original was anyway, because they've all been burnt.
So, maybe I'll get confused. You're saying one of the strengths of the New Testament is because it's
Yes.
But when you say one of the strengths of the Old Testament, it's hardly changed.
Yes.
Therefore, that makes it weaker.
No, because the Old Testament, because most people couldn't have copied the Old Testament, or weren't allowed to copy the Old Testament, because we can trace it all the way back to 250 years BC, and then trace it through with no errors and no errors and no errors and no errors. And we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls that show for 1,000 years it didn't change. That's great news. But if we had the New Testament, and that was literally the same all the way, because there's so much of it out there. In fact, actually, let me show you from this. Because there's so much of it. So there's 5,700 New Testament texts, 1.2 million pages. Every single variation over the 1,500 years means that actually there's only 1% difference, and 2.9% of that mean a thing. That actually, the fact that it's got lots of differences, if anything, just proves, A, it's been copied a lot of times by a lot of different people, some of whom couldn't really speak the language that well that they were copying from or into, but they were doing it anyway, and it was kind of going around the world. It's I know what you mean, but it's kind of a nice.
When the Old Testament was strictly done by the Jewish rabbis under conditions.
Yeah, so it's got to be the Word of God, the end.
Not just people.
Yeah. And this is just like, great, someone's handed me the Gospel of Mark, I'm going to copy it out and pass it to Ray, so that Ray can know the Gospel of Mark. And the fact that I can't, write accurately enough for Ray, doesn't really matter, which is good. And and this is actually, that line is from Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, but it's in the appendix of his book. So he writes a whole book disproving the existence of, Jesus as God, but in his appendix he says, there's 400,000 differences, none of them actually matter. And he wouldn't have sold as many books if that had been on the front cover and not in the appendix. And as an example, here's some of the problems, or rather, here's some of the differences. And if you think as well, so New Testament-wise, it would have been sometimes a room like this one person reading the New Testament, 50 people in the scriptorium writing it down. If I'm reading Revelation to you and you're all writing it down, well, if I read the word Lusanti, well, actually, you don't know whether I mean Lusanti, L-O-U, washed us from our sins, or Lusanti, L-U-S, freed us from our sins. So Esther might write down L-O-U-S-A-N-T-I, and Gillian might write down L-U-S-A-N-T-I, and I've said it the same, and now there's a textual variant, and it doesn't matter. And that's where you get the kind of Old Testament wouldn't have that, New Testament does kind of problem. Or kind of issue, not problem. And there's another one. One letter difference in the Greek. Different words, different text. Does that matter? No, not at all. And that's another one of the 400,000 variants. None of it matters. And even after the invention of the printing press, still some mistakes. So in 1631, Robert Barker was responsible for printing "Thou shalt commit adultery" in the Bible. And he lost his job and ended up in prison. But, obviously you shouldn't be making that kind of mistake, but people make mistakes. I guess the main hopefully the main purpose of this tonight particularly has been, language is complex, full stop. Language is very complex. When you're translating from, for example, Hebrew into Greek, into Latin, into English, or any combination of those language differences, and you're doing it across thousands of years, it's complex. It's very complex to do. So there's going to be language issues, there's going to be translation problems, there's going to be words that literally don't exist in the language that you're trying to figure out and so on. There's any number of lots of problems, not to mention massive persecution and everything being destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt and so on and so forth. And, you know, but hopefully the main thing from this evening really is, yes, there are going to be textual issues in the Bible. Obviously there are, because for all the reasons we've discussed tonight, any number of them, but actually when you do look at them and analyze them, and you know, next week we'll get into some of the, I guess, meatier challenges, I think, for want of a better word. When you do, you still end up, so I'm just looking for this particular slide. Sorry. There you go. When you do, you still end up going, well, I can still trust the Bible way more than I can trust any other piece of literature that's ever been written for any number of thousands of reasons. And actually, you can even turn the problems and the challenges into positives anyway, because we haven't had anyone like the Islam leader in the 7th century going, from now onwards, burn all that and this is it. That hasn't happened ever. All we've had is people like us trying to copy it out quickly and pass it along, and yes, there's going to be challenges and issues, but that also means you're going to have thousands and thousands of manuscripts, and basically if you do look across the thousands of years, they're all the same, and they all prove that the Bible is true. I think. That is my opinion. And I think Paul wrote Hebrews. Any I'm Andy Kind. It's been lovely to be with you tonight. What we're doing next week, let me show you. Actually, there's a nice quote to finish. The church does not control the canon, but the canon controls the church. And that's where we're going to pick up next week, basically. How did the Bible actually become the Bible? Who decided? What about the Apocrypha? What about the Catholic Bible? What about all these things that might or might not be, should have been in it, but aren't in it? Michael? Yeah. I don't know. Not many, basically, because the Old Testament was so rigidly copied, absolute, set fire or burnt when it had any errors. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, if this was 1938 now, no Dead Sea Scrolls, we'd be guessing more than we are. So, it's good. So, last thing. What I'll do is, Sam's going to edit this this video that Brian's kindly been recording tonight and been recording. Sam's going to edit it and we'll put it online if you should want to refer back to it. They're all really good books. Those are the books that I kind of went through to put this together. So that's on there as well. I'll send out the PowerPoint. There is a big appendix that will be on the PowerPoint as well, so if you do want to get into the Greek Septuagint and how, Hebrew became Greek and where does Latin fit into it and all that kind of stuff, that's there as part of the PowerPoint that we have deliberately haven't gone into tonight. But that's all there if you want to go into it on the PowerPoint. And next week we'll pick up, for those that want to, we'll pick up with how did the Bible as we know it actually become the Bible and not the Apocrypha and so on. More important textual issues, so more meaty problems, more problematic problems, which are easy to solve, but more problematic problems. Disputed books of the New Testament. So, for quite a long time, James, for example, or Jude were discussed and argued about and so on. The Apocrypha and why that isn't part of the Bible. And the Gnostic Gospels, so Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, that kind of, why not? Why don't you just stick those in the Bible? And so on. So we'll go through some of that next week. If you want to email me any questions, there's my email address. And anything you want to do, kind of like, what about this, what about that, just ping me some questions and we'll try and go through it.
Martin, can I say, if anyone that wants a PowerPoint, just make sure that you signed up to this group and then
Okay.
make sure you can get to the right people. We've both been hacked, but...
Do they need to have been approved by you as well? Or should they not have been? Okay. So basically, don't read your Bible on the phone, and see you next week.